There were two large explosions inside Poland, close to the Ukrainian border, and just moments ago an intelligence official in America confirmed that missiles had crossed into Poland, a NATO member, remember, killing 2 people. The emergency meeting of the Polish National Security Council is currently taking place. There are various scenarios. We don't know what the actual targets are. It could be that a missile overshot Ukraine and landed in Poland. Sometimes the air defense missiles hit missiles coming in and send them off course. These are some of the scenarios that are possible, but of course we don't know because we don't know what the targets were. But this is potentially a serious escalation. Back to what happened in Ukraine, as all eyes were on Kherson over the last week, people may have forgotten that there is a concerted effort by Russia to target civilian infrastructure, to take out people's water, to take out their heating, to take out their lighting, and that is a war crime.
Well, I'm joined now by Fabrice Potier, a former director of policy planning at NATO. People will be very concerned about the implications of Article 5, collective defence. Obviously, we know very little about this, but what's your instincts telling you?
Well, clearly we know too little to trigger Article 5, but what we are seeing is enough to potentially trigger Article 4, which is basically just below Article 5 is when Poland can ask the other NATO members to come around, meet at the NATO headquarters and assess the level of the threat, and then possibly take some prudent actions, defensive actions. So it's not a full-blown Article 5, but I think Article 4 would be, at that stage, important to mark that a line has been crossed, even by accident, but a line has been crossed, and NATO needs to give a collective answer.
Right, and so you're saying that even if it is an accident, there could be some sort of collective action.
Yes, and it can be defensive at first, for example, augmenting Poland's air defense systems and also augmenting Ukraine's air defense system, because let's not forget that Ukraine is the first line of defense of the NATO alliance. So I do think that there is enough ground here to take some form of defensive actions, which don't have to be against Russia, but is more to protect NATO and in this case also Ukraine. I think what's important to remember is when you throw 100 missiles and rockets at civilian population centers, this type of thing happens.
We should also remind viewers that
misfiring happens, and so Russia should not be surprised. Yes.
Sorry, the internet line is a little broken, but we should remind viewers that, in fact, the Pentagon have refused to confirm this, despite the unnamed source on Associated Press. But in terms of the process, if Poland asks, does the rest of NATO have to respond, or is it a discussion?
Well, it has to be a discussion because there has to be an assessment, and it's profoundly political assessment as to what does this mean? What does this mean in terms of threat and risks for a NATO member like Poland and possibly others? So it has to be a political consultation first, and then that can lead to some defensive or more active actions.
Fabrice Potier, thank you very much indeed for joining us. So just to reiterate, it is unconfirmed at the moment, but there are reports of an explosion in Poland, and there is one report of US intelligence attributing it to a Russian missile, and we don't know any more than that for now, beyond the fact that there is a security meeting going on in the Polish government right now.
Krish, so over the last week, as the Russians have been withdrawing from Kherson City, there was a lull in the missile strikes on Ukraine, but today we saw one of the largest. And it is not an accident, I don't think, that happens to coincide with the G20 meeting in Bali today. Around 100 cruise missiles were launched, just over 70 were intercepted. Kyiv, Lviv and other cities were hit. 2 residential buildings were hit. 1 person, we understand, died. Half of Kyiv is without power tonight and 80% of Lviv.
Just before we came on air, I spoke to the Ukrainian politician Dmytro Nataluka, himself in a location now plunged into darkness by the attacks on the power grid. And I began by asking him to give his assessment of the impact and aim of today's attacks.
I think it was the biggest attack on the Ukrainian electricity grid and energetic infrastructure, energy infrastructure, since the war started. Russia has launched, I think, more than 100 missiles and then unmanned drones targeting civilian infrastructure and, unfortunately, some residential premises.
And what do you think this was about? Was it a reply to President Zelensky's speech? Or is this about Kherson, or a bit of everything?
No, I think it's just, you know, in a way, Putin is continuing to do what he intended to do, to suppress the Ukrainian spirit, to kind of fight the resistance of the people. In a way, you know what? I think that. In the beginning of this war, what happened is that our army was put to test. And the army passed this test, and now it's a different army. I mean, it's very self-confident, it's very virtuous, it's very decisive. Now it's probably the time for the civilian population to pass the same test. And we have to do the same. We have to do it in our dark cities, in our cold apartments, in our vehicles without fuel. But once this winter is over, I think it's going to be a different nation.
We saw a 10-point plan from the president yesterday, which obviously Russia is not going to accept. I mean, almost everything in it was totally unacceptable to Moscow. So how is this war going to be finished?
Look, this war is going to be finished, I think, in my opinion, just as any other war, with some settlement, with some document. The question is when and with whom on the Russian side, because I'm afraid that as long as Putin is in power, not just the Ukrainians, but the whole continent cannot feel safe. And for that reason, I think that we should win this war for good, and then try to settle the results of us pushing Russia back to its internationally recognized borders and agreeing on the further terms of coexistence.
And if military victory takes however long, can Ukraine withstand that? Can the people withstand that? I mean, you're sitting there in darkness tonight.
Yeah, but believe me, I mean, it's much better than sitting under Russian occupation or being obliged to refuse my identity, to refuse my history, to refuse my cultural code, my heritage. So for us, it's a very simple decision. I mean, either way, we keep on fighting and resisting, or we submit to Russia and cease to exist.
At the moment, these attacks are not causing mass casualties. Do you fear that that might be the next step?
I think that right now is all about intimidating the civil population, intimidating the mayors of the cities. But I'm sure he will not succeed, because so far the Ukrainian nation is as united as ever.
The president's message tonight is for people to stay in their bunkers. Is this how people will stay alive?
Yeah. A lot of people have been out in the city today. I've heard and I've seen the explosions, and people were going down to anywhere where there is an underground or some basement where they can take refuge in any kind of shelters. And in my opinion, this is the response of Putin for missing the G20, which we now call the G19, I think that this is some agony, because what we are witnessing is the beginning of Putin's eclipse in terms of his international image, that's for sure.